You know that feeling, right? When you hear an old myth or you're just walking through the woods and something clicks. Something feels more deeply true than any self-help book you've ever read. Well, a lot of us feel that way, and today we're going to get into exactly why that is. So, this is the big question we're tackling. Why is it that these ancient ways of knowing, wisdom from nature, folklore, old spiritual traditions, why do they sometimes hit us on a level that modern, evidence based therapy just doesn't quite reach? It's a really common experience, and it turns out the answer isn't about ditching therapy, but about asking a much, much better question. Right. So, to really get this, we don't start by putting therapy and wisdom in a boxing ring to see which one wins. Nope. We start by looking at the very lens we're using to see them, the way we even frame the question. That's our first big clue. Just think about this for a second. The second we call the people who came up with things like CBT or psychoanalysis human experts, something really important has already happened. We've stopped treating their work as this universal capital T truth. Instead, just like you see here, we've kind of taken it off the pedestal and put it on a shelf with everything else. We're seeing it for what it is, a cultural product, made by specific people at a specific point in history. And let's be super clear, this is not about attacking therapy. The point isn't to be antagonistic. It's about what the source material calls anthropological precision. It's like looking at something the way an anthropologist would, with curiosity and respect, trying to understand it in its own context, not to tear it down. So, what happens when we actually do that? When we put on these anthropologist glasses and look at modern therapy, how does that change what we see? Well, it reveals it as something really specific, not something universal. Using this gaze, we see every system of meaning as a cultural production. And all that really means is that they're artifacts. They're tools made by people for people. A shaman's ritual, an ancient Greek philosophy, or the diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders. They're all human creations, built for a specific job. And that simple shift lets us study Western therapy as one fascinating, powerful tool among many, not the one and only operating system for being human. And from this perspective, modern therapy has three really clear attributes. First, it's historically contingent. It wasn't handed down from the heavens. It was born out of the very specific mindset of the post-Enlightenment West. Second, it's locally coherent. And this is important. Within its own rules, its own scientific logic, it makes perfect sense and it works. And third, because of those first 2 points, it becomes an option among many. It's one incredible entry in this huge global library of human wisdom. Okay, and this is where things get really interesting, because this leads us to the biggest difference of all, how these systems actually create knowledge in the first place. They're not just saying different things, they're built in totally opposite directions. So first up, you've got the clinical model. It's totally top-down. It all starts with a theory, right? An idea, a hypothesis about how the mind works. Then, from that theory, you design a protocol, a technique you can repeat. And finally, you conduct research to get validation, the hard data that proves your theory was right. Here, knowledge is built, then tested, then confirmed from the outside. Now, the wisdom model, it's the complete opposite. It's totally ground up. It doesn't start with a theory. It starts with a direct experience, a massive, undeniable insight. Like the Buddha's enlightenment. The knowing happens first. And only after that raw experience do you get the articulation. People trying their best to describe it using stories, poems, or riddles. And then finally, you create practices to help other people get a taste of that direct experience for themselves. Here, the theory is just a map pointing back to the real treasure. So because of this fundamental split, top-down versus ground-up, you end up with these four massive differences in how these models actually show up in the world. First one, focus. The clinical model, for the most part, locates the problem inside you. It's your brain chemistry, your thought patterns, your personal trauma. The goal is to fix the individual. But wisdom traditions, they often see distress as a disturbance in a much wider field. It's like a forest. You can't heal a sick tree by only looking at the tree. You have to look at the soil, the fungi, the water, the whole interconnected system it's a part of. Second is power. In the clinical model, you've got a pretty clear hierarchy, right? The expert knows and they treat the patient. Knowledge flows one way, from the top down. In a wisdom tradition, that dynamic is totally different. A teacher or a guide might point the way, but the whole goal is for the student to become the teaching themselves, to have their own direct experience. And when that happens, the hierarchy just dissolves. Third difference, what counts as evidence? What's the proof? The clinical model puts its faith in statistics, in randomized controlled trials, in p-values. For a wisdom tradition, the evidence is its own survival. It's the fact that it has worked for thousands of years. Think about something like Aboriginal songlines. These are unbelievably complex maps of knowledge that have been passed down for 60,000 years. They're not validated by a research paper. They're validated by the fact that the culture is still here. And finally, there's scope. To become a legitimate science, modern psychology had to perform a kind of surgery. It had to carefully separate itself from spirituality, from the big questions. But in doing that, it left this big empty space where meaning, purpose, and the sacred used to be. Wisdom traditions, they never made that cut. For them, healing your own personal suffering is always, always connected to finding your place in the grand scheme of things. So you see these huge differences, and the goal isn't to say one is good and one is bad. The real work, the really important work, is to build a bridge between them. But why exactly is that so important? So why bother building this bridge? Well, there are a few really good reasons. For one, it's just pragmatic. If you want to work with people in the current system, you have to be able to speak their language. It's also ethical. These deep insights shouldn't be locked away for a select few. We need to make them accessible to everyone. And finally, it's tactical. A good bridge gives someone a starting point, a familiar therapeutic idea that they can then use to walk over into this much, much bigger landscape of wisdom. And this table is such a cool example of how this bridging actually works. Check this out. Let's take a concept like disruption, a crisis. In therapy language, you might call that pushing the edges of your window of tolerance. But in a wisdom or nature-based language, you might call it katabasis, which is the hero's journey down into the underworld. Or you might just call it composting, see? Or look at emergence. Therapy calls that post-traumatic growth. Nature just calls it spring. It's the same reality, just spoken in different, equally valid languages. And that really brings us to the core of it all, captured perfectly in this quote from the source material. It's not about being different just to argue, or being unique just to feel special. It's about something much simpler. Ultimately, this whole thing isn't an argument. It's not a competition. It's an invitation to see that every system of knowledge is just a view from a different spot on the hill. The real work isn't to prove your spot is best. It's just to stand where you're standing, describe what you see as clearly and as honestly as you can, and then start building bridges so other people can come and share the view. It's really about humility and accuracy and connection. Thanks for digging into this with me today.